You know, I love my guy, Ben Shapiro. You hear him at 2 o'clock here on KCMO Talk Radio. He is doing great for us on 95.7 FM, and we agree on a lot of things. But I heard his analysis of the VP debate yesterday afternoon, and I thought that in that moment, Ben was getting a little too idealistic. He was talking about J.D. Vance and his approach on the issue of abortion, which obviously has been a loser, unfortunately, for Republicans. And what J.D. Vance basically said is he showed empathy for anyone who has ever had to deal with such a thing, while then noting, listen, Donald Trump and I believe this is now a state issue. It's not a federal issue. That's what the Supreme Court decided, and that's our approach. So basically, they're trying to make this a totally hands-off thing at the federal government level because they don't want it to hurt them politically. And they said, you know what, let the people decide in the states what they want to do. And that's how it is. And in that moment, I thought that was a fine approach from J.D. Vance. Ben Shapiro said this.
And there are a bunch of tacks that Republicans can take with regard to this issue. When it comes to Trump-Vance, the tack that they've taken is we're not doing federal legislation on this issue. We're not looking at that. That's not something we're interested in. The Supreme Court itself has suggested that federal legislation is inapposite, that this probably should be delegated down to the states, and there really isn't much the federal government can do. J.D. Vance was trying to soften his appeal to women. Clearly. He was trying to say to them, listen, I feel you. I empathize with you. I get it. Hey, the problem is that the argument that he made last night was really not an argument so much as an emotional appeal. And while I admire the skill with which it was done, I do not appreciate the political and value line that undergirds it, which basically suggests that the big problem is that we just haven't convinced enough people in the United States that a woman should choose life rather than choosing abortion. That may be true. That is also not the issue as to legislation.
Okay, well, Ben's getting very idealistic there. That VP debate is really not the time to really get in the weeds on abortion legislation. That VP debate, all you want to do on that issue right now, because it's unfortunately, due to where our society is, really the only strong point that Democrats have going for them right now, you just want to get that issue to a draw in that moment. That's it. The time to be idealistic about abortion policy is either in a primary, when you're selecting your candidate, or when you actually get your preferred candidates into elected office. Not on a VP debate stage where you're in a 3-on-1 situation against Tim Walz and 2 moderators who you know are out to get you. And who desperately, and then you also know your opponent desperately wants you to say something that they can flip into a commercial. Like, I love Ben, but this whole notion of like, we've got to use this moment to really make our case. No. And it's not J.D. Vance's job in that moment to do that. And like J.D. Vance, I consider myself a pro-lifer, but you also have to be like realistic in terms of what the moment is. The VP debate stage is not the moment for that, where you might trip up over yourself. You might say something that maybe doesn't come out right. What's done is done. You have 2 clear options when it comes to these tickets on this issue. No one is being swayed in that moment on that issue by J.D. Vance or by Tim Walz. So that is not the moment to get all wonky about legislation and, you know, what actually should be happening at the federal level. That's not the place to do it. It's not. It's like if you're Patrick Mahomes and you're in a big game and you're thinking to yourself, boy, I want to throw for 300 yards today. Well, not if you lose the game, you don't. No, you just want to do whatever you have to do to win the game in that moment. And if they're leaving 3 safeties back and letting you run the ball, you run the ball to win the game. You don't worry about your personal stats. You don't worry about the purity of the moment. You do what you have to do, in the words of Herm Edwards, to win the game, John. That's it.
To your point about elaborating, see if this sounds familiar. Senator, we have a lot to get to, Senator. Thank you, Senator.
Yes. Yeah. We don't need more of that. So I just think that Ben is missing the broader point here in terms of what was appropriate in that moment, in that setting. Ben and myself and J.D. Vance agree on the issue. But the spots that you choose matter. And in that setting, J.D. Vance played it perfectly. He said, we're dealing with this at the state level, and he showed great empathy and sympathy and said, we have to do a better job being just the pro-family party in general, and that's what matters.